Welcome to the Darkstream. Vox Day, voxday.blogspot.com. Sorry about the little audio hiccup there. Had a slight issue. Windows was helpfully improving my experience, and part of improving my experience apparently involved muting my mic inline. I'm not sure how that experience is any better, but here we are. So today, the God Emperor announced 200 billion in new trade tariffs targeted against Chinese imports. And he's also made it clear that if China goes ahead and retaliates, he's going to go ahead and drop even more tariffs on them as well. Now, this, of course, has all the usual suspects, all the free traders, all the neocons, all the people who think that responding, Ricardo, is a meaningful response to tariffs in a tizzy. And they've been upset about this. They've been arguing their theory over and over and over again ever since the first tariffs were announced a couple months ago. But if you notice something, what hasn't happened? What consequence that was predicted by all of these doomsayers didn't come to pass? Instead, what happened is what anti-free trade people like myself predicted would happen, and in fact, what proper economic theory, conventional economic theory, predicts would happen. The economy grew. Now, this is not difficult. This is not at all hard. Now, if you want to argue that the idea of a objective measure of a national economy, especially one that is denominated in a currency, is a contradiction in terms, and that it's not possible to measure a national economy, especially not in its own currency, I would accept that argument. But then there's no point in having this discussion. There's no purpose to this discussion because it's not possible to argue about something that can't be quantified becoming larger or smaller. If you're accepting mainstream economics to the point that you're talking about the economy growing or the economy shrinking, then you have to accept the mainstream theory. And what the mainstream theory very clearly states is that the size of the economy as measured in gross domestic product is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That's consumer spending plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So what happens when you reduce imports? The economy grows. This is an absolute straightforward mathematical relationship. It is a very simple equation. And so it's not at all surprising, despite all the doomsaying, despite all the ridiculous predictions, then the economy has grown. And we've actually seen the fastest growth rates for the economy since the 1980s. Question: would it be better if the other countries, Europe, China, etc., brought down their tariffs on us? It would be better than the alternative of us not having tariffs and accepting their imports and not being able to export to them. It would be better. However, there are some circumstances where it would be just better to not trade with them at all. Now that's very frightening, but you have to realize is that the U.S. economy is very large. The U.S. economy does not need to be a part of the global economy, and in fact, in some ways, it is better for the U.S. and for the U.S. economy, and better for Americans in general to not engage in trade. And so, the more that you understand free trade theory, the more you understand how ridiculous it is. The more you understand how intrinsically anti the national interest it is. And so I'd encourage you to read a book called Free Trade Doesn't Work by Ian Fletcher. It walks you through the Ricardian theory that is the basis and the justification for free trade, and shows very clearly why that argument fails. And so, this is just another example of the God Emperor understanding the core issue much better than his critics, who are calling him uneducated and stupid and all this sort of thing. I've debated two free traders, both of them economists, and in both cases didn't have any problem demonstrating the flaws in their argument. And so the more that you look at the situation, the more you understand that trade in general is international trade in general is intrinsically anti-nationalist. It's actually destructive of the nation. And so there's a connection between the free movement of people and trade that is intrinsically destructive of not only nations, but also communities within the nation. And that's actually one of the problems. The economists like to point to the interstate trade within the United States as being a model for the international trade. But if you actually look at what the consequences of that interstate trade have been, it's been the mass destruction of communities throughout the United States. Gordon says, I think that critics understand full well and are deliberately working against the U.S. That might be true of some of the very elite bankers and so forth. They may have an understanding. Most of the critics genuinely do not understand this. It was very clear when I was talking to some of my debate opponents that they had never ever considered that matter before. Do libertarian economists not understand that giving dollars to foreigners in exchange for stuff means that foreigners use those dollars to buy up your national assets? No, they do understand that, but they believe that it is good to have foreigners buy up your national assets. So, libertarians are fundamentally traders from a national perspective. They often don't realize that. They often don't know that, but they are. If you scratch a libertarian deep enough, he's either not actually a true libertarian, or he's totally opposed to the idea of nations. A good example of that is Gary North. He loves to go into he loves to talk about sticking a gun in your belly, because of these lines on a map. He just doesn't have any concept of nation, and so because of that, his entire line of thinking is poisoned. Question: do you oppose free trade entirely, or is it mostly because some countries will cheat and subsidize their industries? I oppose free trade entirely. Let's see here. their current life circumstances demand they refuse to acknowledge they might be wrong. Well, I think that's true of some folks. Certainly, it's not true of James, the gentleman I debated. Um, he's the professor at, I think it was uh, Marshall, or no, George, whatever it is. I can't, that East Coast University. He was very open to the idea of abandoning free trade once he began to understand what the implications were. You have to understand that my argument against free trade on the basis of the movement of peoples is new. This isn't something that economists have historically considered. Let's see. What about being a libertarian within the context of an ethno-state homogenous nation? There's nothing wrong with being a small L libertarian if you are focused on maximizing liberty within within certain bounds. But you can't be a principled capital L libertarian. That's like saying, well, what about being a communist within the context of an ethno-state? It's irrelevant. It's not going to work. How do you feel about trading up with nations who have as good or better economies than their own? Well, that's when trade is beneficial. That's when you want to trade, and that's why all the countries around the world want to trade with the U.S. because it benefits them. I'm not saying that trade is intrinsically bad. I'm saying that it is either advantageous or it is disadvantageous depending upon your position. And the easier it is for labor to travel, the easier it is for capital to travel, the more likely it is bad for everybody. Gordon has a good point. Economics can help us efficiently manage resources, but it can tell us nothing of what goals to pursue or how to do so. That's correct. If you're constantly pursuing economic growth, you're inevitably going to end up in a place that you don't want to be. You're inevitably going to end up being taken advantage of by people. Advice for a young man, 25, who's going bald and struggling with it. Don't struggle with it. Just shave your head. You might as well get used to it, and there's nothing that looks sillier than somebody trying to hide it. I suppose it's easy enough for me to say, I shave my head. Part of the reason that I've never really sweated the whole receding hairline thing and why I just happily, trimmed it short right away is because I spent about, a year and a half, 2 years with a shaved head when I was young, just because I preferred it when I was doing martial arts. So, but the point is that, things are as they are, and you're much better off accepting them and embracing the situation rather than trying to somehow deny it or hide it. What should the UK, in your mind, do about Brexit? They should implement it tomorrow. They seem overly concerned about staying in the EU single market. They shouldn't be concerned about that at all. Those who are concerned about staying in the EU single market are basically the corporations who have an interest in doing so, and the politicians who are being paid to try to keep Brexit from happening. Since you say that interstate trade, interstate trade within the U.S. is somewhat bad, then how would you counter said trade? I would have to think about that, because the problem with the interstate trade is the way that it causes too many people to move. If you look at it in the U.S., people move around too much. People are moving around chasing jobs, and it kills communities everywhere. let's see here. Does the wage gap between native labor and cheap foreign labor get converted into profits, which are then used to justify higher taxes? They are converted into profits, but they're not usually used to justify higher taxes. How can we get the invaders to leave? Well, I mean, one way would be to end all transfer payments. Stop paying them to invade. That would be a good first step. Ultimately, it's probably going to come down to war. Generally speaking, people don't leave countries until a military forces them to do so. So, anyhow, that's about all I've got tonight. I'm sorry for the short one, but I'm extremely tired, and so I should probably cut this one short tonight. So have a good evening. I should mention that we have a new book out, Vessel of Venus. Check it out on Amazon. And Jack Posobiec's 4D Warfare is now available in print on the Castelia Books Direct Store. So check them out when you get a chance. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next stream. Have a good evening.